Now, we have already discussed that agriculture came up as a source of food for human beings as well as for animals. But agriculture does not only depend on human practices or the tools and the techniques that we are using, it also depends on the environmental conditions, right? Because crops and grains, they need a favorable condition, they need a favorable environment to grow and survive and to be harvested as well. So, around 12,000 years ago, there were major climate shift that was happening, that was taking place. The conditions were quite extreme earlier, but gradually the environment changed and it was relatively shifted towards warmer conditions. This led to development of grasslands. This led to development of other forms of geographical forms. This led to animals migrating from one place to another in search of food. They depended highly on grass such as deer, antelope, goats, sheep, cattle. They all flourish. These are the species that depend mainly on grasslands, that depend mainly on plains in order to find their own food. So, the gradual change in environment took place over the years. It was not an occurrence of one day, it happened over the years. So, what were the effects of this changing environment? How did it affect people? How did it affect humans? How did it affect our earth? So, as the environment changed, as the situations, the climatic conditions developed, the humans, those who used to hunt animals, they started following them. They started to learn about their food habits. Food habits of whom? Animals. Instead of hunting them, they started to follow them, they started to observe them, that how do they live, what do they eat, where do they sleep, what is their breeding period, etc. They started thinking about herding and rearing animals. It was not just about hunting them anymore, it was about herding them, it was about rearing them, it was about domesticating the animals and collectively growing together. Fishing also became a very important activity among people in this time, in order to, of course, feed themselves, but also in order to develop the species further. So, now that climate was changing gradually, there were the effects which were helping the humans in order to develop new methods and new practices of farming and herding. Earlier, they were totally depending on hunting of animals and other creatures in order to feed themselves. But now, with the changing and development of climatic conditions, food grains such as wheat, barley, rice, maize, they started to grow naturally in the atmosphere and around the subcontinent. Thus, it helped men, women and children in order to collect these food grains and consume them as food. So now, the man and the people, they were not only dependent on animals in order to feed themselves or to survive as a source of food. They now scattered and found different kinds of source of food. The climate of the world was changing. So, at the same time, the human practices were also changing. Animals were used as food, but they were also moving towards the practice of domestication. Now, the first animals or the first species of animals which was tamed, which was domesticated, were the wild ancestors of dog. How do we know the wild ancestors of dog? They are known as wolves. So, wolves or the ancestors of the dogs were the early species which were domesticated by human beings. Later on, sheep, goats, deers, cattle, pigs were also used by them. It was not only for the purpose of food, it was for herding and grazing as well. So, now in the previous slide we discussed about a word, domestication. What is domestication? In today's time we see that a lot of people domesticate animals such as dogs, cats, even birds. I have even seen people who keep pets such as tortoise and turtles. This is possible in our days, but how was it possible in the earlier times? We'll see that. Now, What is domestication? It is a process in which people grew plants and looked after animals. They tended to them. They took care of them. Not only for the purpose of hunting and using them as food, but in order to graze them, in order to breed them, to develop the species, to evolve the species. Plants and animals that were tended by the people, that were raised by human beings, became different from wild animals. We can see the same example in our current life, that the stray dogs which are in the streets, they behave in a different way than the dogs which we keep at home. So that is one major difference between how the human species developed domestication as a process and how the animals and their behavior changed over the process of domestication. The early humans, by these development in the practices, developed a new way of life. They found tools in order to grow crops, in order to develop agriculture as a industry, as a mode of survival. At the same time, farming brought stability, because growing plants meant that they would stay in the same place for a long time and they would not have to migrate in order to find food, in order to survive. They started storing those grains in order to feed themselves in the future as well. They began making large clay pots or woven baskets or dug pits into the ground so that they could cook food in it, so that they could store the grains in it. They also began to construct houses for storing grains for the purpose of living, so that they could provide themselves with a shelter and a habitable environment in order to protect themselves from the external factors and external dangers at that time. So, storing of food grains is one thing, but storing of animals is a totally different thing. Now, how is it different from storing of food grains? The early humans domesticated different species of animals such as cattle, goats, sheep, pigs, dogs, etc. They were earlier used as meat, as food by the humans, but later on, as the humans realized that it is very beneficial for them to multiply these animals, as over the period of time in the future they would provide them with the food and their skin can be used for shelter, for keeping them warm, they started to rear them. They started the breeding of these animals. So, they started to create a pool of these animals. They started to multiply them in order to get food, in order to get their products, animal products such as milk, eggs, etc. to feed themselves as well as feed the animals at the same time.